Hi, everyone. My name is Karolina Hike, and I'm a visiting assistant professor of German at Swarthmore College. Today, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my dissertation, which I just finished at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Titled Intersections of Migration, Memory, and Gender in Contemporary Jewish Writing in Germany, my dissertation engages in historically contextualized close readings of three contemporary novels. Olga Gryaznowa's 2012 Der Russe ist einer, der Birken liebt, Lina Gorelik's 2013 Die Listensammlerin, and Sascha Mariana Salzman's 2017 Außer sich, works by writers who self-identify as Jewish, write in German after reunification, and come from families that emigrated to Germany as quota refugees from former Soviet territories in the early 1990s. Though commonly classified as grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, the third generation of German Jews does not always share the ancestral experience of Nazi terror. Rather, as I illustrate, Gryaznova, Gorelik, and Salzman emphasize the connections between multiple precarious positions, memories, and traumas from different national and cultural contexts. Building on recent scholarly discussions that reframe German Jewish literature, I examine how in the novels, migration inflects memory work in conversation with other historical traumas and reconfigurations of Jewishness to highlight the diversity of contemporary Jewish positions and intersectional solidarities beyond ethnic markers. Shifting the focus from literary categorizations to interpretive frameworks and analytical tools through which we read these texts, my study offers a new approach to analyzing German language Jewish writing in three interrelated ways. Reading Jewish identities in an intersectional framework, highlighting the centrality of migration conceptually, thematically, and experientially, and examining discontinuities in the public reception and positioning of texts labeled based on their authors' experiences of migration. I contend that these novels create global literary constellations, drawing on and belonging to multiple traditions beyond one ethnic or national context. In this way, they invite us to reimagine the contemporary valence of the signifier, German Jewish. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amy Lynn Hill, and I'm currently an instructor of German at Austin Peay State University. But as of a few weeks ago, I successfully defended my dissertation at Vanderbilt University as part of a joint program in German comparative media analysis and practice. Overall, my research interests include strategies of abjection and disidentification in body and beauty cultures, both historically in modern Germany, as well as in contemporary discourse on social media. Additionally, I embrace creative practices in my scholarship, and I am perhaps most proud of my stage play Baby Girl Medea, an adaptation of the Medea myth as conceived in German literature, which I set in rural Tennessee, and which was thankfully published last year in a hybrid collection of essays and creative works by the Demeter Press. Of course, to date, the largest project I've done, scholarly, creative, or otherwise, has been my dissertation, which was a deep dive into the history of sexual violence, as it relates to gender and subjectivity in modern German culture by way of the Lustmörderin, which I most often translate into English as the sex murderess, and which recent criminological scholarship in the US has coined the female sexual homicide offender. I was enthralled very early on by how vehemently both criminologists and sexologists were, at the turn of the century and well into the Weimar era, at denying that women were capable of committing the same sorts of brutal sexual crimes as men, a feeling which only intensified when I realized that women have and still do, in fact, commit these types of crimes. In my dissertation, I therefore closely examined the case of 18-year-old Käthe Hagedorn, who confessed in June of 1926 to killing two small children and sexually abusing one of her victims. right outside of Duisburg, Germany. She was convicted 1 year later, but despite a confession and her own testimony, as well as additional evidence that proved the sexual nature of her crimes, she was found guilty not of committing Lustmord, sexual murder, or murder at all, but rather of committing manslaughter by reason of menstrual-induced temporary insanity. Her crime was sexual not insofar as Hagedorn herself was an autonomous subject with sexual agency, but instead, allegedly, because of her physiological weakness at the hands of her own sexual reproductive organs. As I argued in my dissertation, in the overlapping histories of sexology and criminology in Germany, the sexual crimes of women featured heavily. Yet, while discussions about the sexual crimes of men revolved around lurid tales of sex murder, the same was not true for women. No, instead, the trial of Käthe Hagedorn shows us that popular narratives about women's sexual crimes centered not around their sexuality, but around their allegedly biologically dictated drive to be a mother. This is why I argue we should take women's alleged wrongs seriously, because more often than not, women are granted no more agency in the crimes they commit than the lives that they live. And ultimately, as we've seen in the Hagedorn case, that means that the victims of the crimes they actually do commit will never truly see justice in either the court of law or public opinion. And this isn't just true in recent history. The legacy of much of this discourse still resonates today, especially in the rhetoric of increasingly anti-feminist movements, whose members researchers have shown often appropriate sexological discourses that are now considered antiquated and pseudoscientific at best. This is an alarming trend that I came across while working on a collaboration about female rage, and which I plan on exploring further in a project about the folk hero appropriation of philosopher Otto Weininger, whose work was incredibly influential in the early decades of sexology in Germany and Austria. He is now considered a hero in what is commonly referred to as the manosphere, home of the self-proclaimed incels, or involuntary celibates, which the state of Texas declared an, quote, emerging domestic terrorism threat in 2020. When I began my dissertation in the spring of 2018, I knew the work I was doing was important, but I never could have predicted how, unfortunately, even more relevant my research would become into the history of sexology and the constellation of gender, subjectivity, and sexual violence. I look forward to continuing this work and am thankful to have the opportunity to share it with you all at the GSA Food for Thought initiative. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Carestis, and I am the American University and Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies postdoctoral fellow. I am a historian of modern Germany, and I specialize in photography during the Nazi period. My work challenges the tendency to think about photography primarily in terms of material images and what they show. Instead, my research goes beyond the photographs themselves to emphasize photography's role as a social practice. Approaching photography in this way not only helps to explain the contents of the many pictures Germans made during the Nazi era, it also helps explain why they took those pictures to begin with. My first book project examines photograph albums compiled by soldiers and their families during the Second World War to explore why so many Germans took up photography under Nazism. When I started working in the archives, I expected these albums to mostly contain atrocity pictures, given the existing scholarship on the subject. But that is not what I found. Instead, I saw far more banal scenes of leisure and sociability in these albums, and I wanted to know why. Part of the answer, I learned, involves the broader history of photography in Germany in the decades prior to the Nazi rise to power. But I discovered as well that the answer also lies with how the Nazi regime configured popular photography after 1933. Nazi officials envisioned it as a social practice that could transform and unite non-Jewish Germans as members of a Volksgemeinschaft. The dictatorship promoted photography among non-Jewish Germans and excluded Jews from the practice. In doing so, Germans learned to see photography as an act defined by the absence of Jews. Once the war began, many Germans used their cameras to enact this official configuration of photography and chose to showcase their ties to each other rather than their anti-Semitism. While I was conducting research for my first book project, I noticed that one man figured particularly prominently in official records on photography in Nazi Germany, Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer. My second book project, which I am currently writing, is a biography of Hoffmann. The project investigates his life and career to show how practicing photography gave Hoffmann social power in the Nazi dictatorship and provided him with opportunities for economic and political advancement. Hoffmann's opportunism, as well as his anti-Semitism, reveals that Hoffmann was never just the subservient photographer he is typically made out to be. Rather, he was precisely the type of man who made the Nazi dictatorship possible, and precisely the type of Nazi who ensured that the regime would last for as long as it did. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Porter. I'm an assistant professor of German at The Ohio State University, and my research areas of focus can be categorized as broadly pertaining to body politics in German 20th and 21st century history and culture. While my dissertation looked at the medium of tattooing as an avenue of cultural investigation and inspection, I'm currently working on a project that continues the discussion from my first article that looked at renowned German film director Fritz Lang and his premiere Hollywood film that was released in 1936 titled Fury. In my research that falls under German-American cultural exchange, policing politics as they relate to the relationship of trust between law enforcement and the communities that they have sworn to protect has become an active topic of discourse not only in the United States, but in German-speaking Europe as well. I published the first installment of this research conversation in 2020 by examining the racial political commentary Lang invested in his Black secondary characters in Fury, and I connected that commentary with Lang's warnings against blindly investing trust and value in filmic evidence of sequential events, and I brought those warnings into conversation with the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement. Intersecting my research with my approach to teaching, that same year on September 8th and 9th of 2020, I offered my then students at Denison University the opportunity to learn about some of the similarities and differences in policing approaches in Germany in comparison to the United States. I offered voluntary teach-ins as a form of protest against police brutality in light of George Floyd's murder just a few months prior. Floyd's unjust death resulted in a surge in the Black Lives Matter movement, which many forget began a decade ago in 2013 in response to the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in 2012. My current project continues my investigation of Fury by exploring how investments of power in the police can be observed as clashing with those of the civilian community in the film. This is an additional topic of exploration I read as uniquely insightful and applicable to our current moment, as everyday civilians in America, as well as in German-speaking Europe, turn to their phones as instruments for accountability in the pursuit of justice. This line of research addresses the power struggle taking place in front of the lens as a filmed body with a badge can quickly dissolve into the anonymized body of the particularly white masses when the moving image is being used to blur the lines between duty and conflicting social responsibilities. I thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Hello, my name is Sky Shannon Savage. I'm a sixth-year PhD candidate in Columbia University's Department of Germanic Languages. In this upcoming academic year, I'll be conducting research in Berlin with support from the DAAD, which is why I can't be with you all today. But I'm very thankful for this opportunity to talk about my research. My previous work has been loosely located in the field of disability studies, where I've looked at the role of deafness in 18th century philosophical and scientific debate, in particular as it plays out in the work of Karl Philipp Moritz. Recently, I've situated my work in the field of the medical humanities, a move which purposefully invokes a particular set of disciplinary conflicts and epistemological hierarchies, which I find urgent to understand in both their historical and contemporary expressions. The dissertation project is titled The Performativity of Diagnosis, Medicine, Fascism, and Identity in Post-War German Culture. That the rhetoric of sickness and health was pervasive in post-war political and literary discourses has been well researched. In the late 1950s, Theodor Adorno entered into a polemic with Georg Lukács regarding the use of terms like health and sickness in criticism, claiming that such terms could no longer in good conscience be used after the degeneracy campaigns of National Socialism. In the midst of this argument, however, prominent medically credentialed thinkers such as Karl Jaspers and Alexander Mitscherlich utilized their expertise to comment on the dire political circumstances of the German people, in some cases using highly medicalizing language to explain the phenomenon of fascism. Diagnoses have a, quote, performative power, end quote, reliant on systems of institutional validation. And just as we see today, medical terms occupy an uneasy and fraught place in language, holding the power to assign, overwhelm, and alter identities, provided they are uttered in the correct settings and by the correct individuals. Drawing on contemporary work in the sociology of medicine, I seek to move beyond an analysis of this language's problematic rhetorical strategy and attempt to gain a better understanding of what Snyder and Mitchell have named the, quote, diagnostic regimes, end quote, of medical care in the post-war period. In Berlin, I'm currently researching the archives of the Wittenauer Heilstätten, also known as the Karl Bonhoeffer Nervenklinik, a psychiatric hospital with a history spanning from the German Empire through the Nazi period and into the final years of West Germany. Through an analysis of patient intake forms and diagnostic schema, I contend that psychiatric hospitals, such as the K-Bonn in the post-war period, were in fact inscribing post-war political debates onto the bodies of their patients through their power to diagnose. So in the dissertation, I ask, what are the multi-directional lines of influence found in the historically fraught and consequential medicalizing discourse of the post-war period and the experience of psychiatric care in the aftermath of the war? And how did authors and artists of the post-war period experience and come to terms with this medicalizing rhetoric? This final question is what bounds my project in the literary. In seeking to further define the ways in which medicine and fascism impacted personal identities and experiences after the war, I turn to two authors whose works are situated within a particular nexus of national guilt, gender relations, and medical authority. Ingeborg Bachmann's Der Fall Franze illustrates the, in many ways, irresistible power of medical language through her telling of a story of a woman whose psychiatrist husband destroys her identity by turning her into one of his case subjects. Additionally, Unike Zürn, who was herself forcibly institutionalized at the Karl Bonhoeffer Nervenklinik, writes fragmentary and surreal texts which often feature fascist figures blurring the line between doctor and military despot, as well as depicting female characters as both victims and perpetrators complicit in fascist atrocity. I position these works at the end of my analysis of post-war diagnostic regimes in order to demonstrate how these two authors theorized in implicit and explicit ways the inextricable affinities of politics, medicine, and gender, themes which continue to hold deep relevance for the ways in which we navigate medical authority and identity today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Brandy E. Wilcox, and I am so excited to have been invited to discuss my research with you today. My project, drawn from my dissertation titled Of Walt and Welt, Power and Gender in East German and U.S. American Fairy Tale Film, examines the gendered hierarchy of power present in the Grimm fairy tales and their cinematic adaptations in East Germany and the United States. Centering my analysis on the adaptations of the Grimm's Rapunzel and Der Froschkönig oder der Eiserne Heinrich, I identify these power structures by analyzing the consequence of women's misbehavior. Female protagonists get in trouble and are punished for behaviors and actions that they enact against male protagonists and villains of any gender, but the same is not true in reverse. And when these punishment phases appear in adaptations of these tales by Defa and Walt Disney, the punishments are lengthened and strengthened. To discuss how gender behavior rules are reinforced through selective enforcement and punishment, I draw on Walter Burkert's Mädchentragödie, or Maiden's Tragedy, for narrative analysis, and I connect that with Judith Butler's argument that, quote, gender identity is a performative accomplishment compelled by social sanction and taboo. She complicates this statement from her 1988 essay, Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, an essay in phenomenology and feminist theory, in her monograph, Gender Trouble. Drawing on the double usage of the word trouble as both making trouble and getting in trouble, Butler then notes Sartre's categorization of desire as trouble, and how when desire is reversed from the masculine desiring the feminine, it, quote, contests the place and authority of the masculine position. The fairy tale films included in my study contest this position through lying and deception, social climbing, and anger, effectively causing trouble and disrupting the presumed power dynamics of the gender binary. Within the narrative structure of the tale, the punishment for these reversals occurs in the fourth stage of Walter Burkert's Maiden's Tragedy, a sequence of 5 functions observed in tales of maidens drawn from antiquity and applied here for fairy tales. The 5 sequential functions outlined by Burkert begin with the woman leaving home, followed by a period of idyllic isolation or seclusion, intrusion and catastrophe, suffering and punishments, and then rescue with salvation. In the adaptations of Rapunzel and Der Froschkönig, the 4th, suffering stage, is where the punishment for acting out against expected gendered behavior is added or expanded in both the Defa and Disney films. Burkert himself actually drew on the Rapunzel tale to illustrate this punishment stage, noting how her pregnancy follows the catastrophe of the fairy tale, namely the intrusion of the prince. For the sake of staying within time, I'd like to focus only on the Rapunzel tale, in which a woman desires an herb, or a vegetable, or a flower, depending on the adaptation, that is growing in the garden of a magic woman, the villain of the tale. This desire is sated by her husband's theft of the plant, but then punished when the villain demands the child as payment. Here we have an example of the punishment of feminine desire right at the start of the tale. This villain then locks the young child, named for whatever her mother desired while pregnant, away from the world. That seclusion is disrupted by a prince and an implied sexual relationship. Her punishment, in the Grimm's version of the tale, banishment to a desert and bearing twins while her princely companion wanders blindly in an attempt to find her, suits the misbehavior of her sexual desire. However, in examining the cinematic adaptations of this tale, neither Defa nor the Walt Disney Company maintained this pregnancy as punishment. The loss of body autonomy present in the Grimm versions is, however, heightened in these films. Before being abandoned by Gothel and then bricked into her tower, Rapunzel in East Germany is rendered mute and helpless as she watches her prince fall from the tower into the thorns below. She escapes, but then, after journeying through the wilderness to the prince's castle, is caught up in a Jungfrau Marleen tale in which she is forced to deceive her prince and take the part of a false bride. The expansion of this punishment is also present in Disney's Tangled, in which Rapunzel faced not only increased imprisonment through Gothel's use of chains, but also has to heal her prince of a death blow rather than simply blindness. In conclusion, in analyzing these extended punishment phases for female protagonists, it is possible to identify the gendered power dynamics within these fairy tales. These gendered consequences for female misbehavior in these narratives mirror hierarchies present in society, reflecting not only the 19th century assumptions and expectations of gender roles from the Grimm's times, but a continuity of those expectations for women in society today.